He stopped the car suddenly as the black dog came out of nowhere, stark against the white snow. It ran in front of his car and refused to move. He leaned on the horn before taking stock of the situation, and the strangest feeling came over him as he looked into the dog's eyes. His instincts told him it was trying to tell him something. On the cold morning of February 15, 2015, Officer Jeff Gonzalez was patrolling the quiet neighborhood of Autumn Ridge, Wisconsin. He was stopped in his tracks by the strangest sight. The snow had collected in huge drifts around him, and the roads were eerily quiet, but he soon realized he wasn't alone. The dog ran alongside him for a while, and although Jeff was concerned for the dog, the situation took a sinister turn. The Labrador Retriever appeared to be looking for someone. The wind outside was bitterly cold, and it was no place for anyone, animal or human, to be out in. That's when the officer decided to investigate. Officer Gonzalez had a feeling in the pit of his stomach there was more to the dog running in the road. When he drove a little closer, he saw the movement was odd. It would run up to the road for a few feet, bark frantically, then stop and look around before running back down again. He got out of his car and approached the dog. Although his training had prepared him for any situation, nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. His boots crunched in the snow as he approached from behind, and suddenly the dog turned. He was able to catch the flash of metal name tag on his collar, but before he could grab the dog, it was off again. Getting back in his car, the officer decided to try a different tactic. He wound his window down and drove alongside the dog as it sprinted up and down the road. Suddenly, the dog noticed he was being followed and he stopped dead in his tracks. He raised his head to look at the officer and stood absolutely still, tail wagging. Thinking his plan had worked, Gonzalez opened the door carefully and tried to approach the dog, but the same thing happened. As soon as his boots hit the ground, the dog took off running. Gonzalez had no hope of catching him, so he got back in his car and drove after him. But the dog was not going to be caught so easily. The officer had sworn to protect and serve the community, and to him that included its four-legged friends. But what he didn't know was that the black lab alone in the snow that day wasn't the only one who needed saving. If only he had listened to his instincts sooner. If only he could have known what the frantic dog had been trying to tell him. As he crested the rise, he noticed that he couldn't see the dog. But where had he gone? His eyes moved from one side of the snow-covered pavement to the other, but the black dog was nowhere. Suddenly, he saw its outline in his headlights as he slammed on the brakes and swerved. His wheels screeched and he shuddered on the icy road, but the dog hadn't moved. It was sitting in the middle of the road, motionless. An eerie sight, a lonely black dog sitting silently in his headlights as the snow fell gently all around it. The officer, shaken, paused for a second as the dog raised his head and looked directly into his eyes. They shared a strange, silent moment, and then he knew. As if understanding that the man finally understood what it wanted, the dog started to walk again, looking back over his shoulder every few paces, beckoning the officer to follow him with his amber eyes. Gonzalez drove behind the dog until they rounded the bend into a driveway in the County Line Road, where he was met with a sight that turned his blood to ice in his veins. From a distance, Officer Gonzalez could make out somebody sitting on the porch, but there was something off about the way the body slumped over, motionless. He wasted no time wondering what had happened and rushed over, fearing the worst. He touched the woman's skin, and it was icy cold. Was he too late? The woman's lips were blue, and she had been out in the cold for a while. Gonzalez pulled her collar aside and searched for a pulse, but found none. Then he felt a small quiver beneath the woman's skin, faint, but it was there, the weakest of pulses. Realizing that the woman was still alive, he dashed back to his squad car and radioed for help, all too aware that time was running out. Backup arrived shortly afterward, and Officer Gonzalez was able to move the freezing woman into the house. They managed to find ID and discovered that the woman's name was Crystal Wendt. While they waited for the ambulance, they knew they had to call her next of kin, Tian. It was a call they wished they didn't have to make. Tian picked up the phone and was startled to hear the officer. Gonzalez quickly explained that her mother was in critical condition, but help was on the way. When Gonzalez explained what had happened, he thought it was too late. She was overcome with tears and she broke down, but agreed to get to the hospital as soon as she could. She arrived at the hospital where Crystal had been taken with her stricken aunt in tow, but they could only wait to hear about their beloved mother and sister. The minutes ticked by and they waited, but it seemed like an eternity before the doctors appeared. The first thing the doctor told them was that, thankfully, she had been saved just in time. The doctor also went on to say that Crystal had fallen unconscious because of a heart condition she had never even known she had. Her doctor determined she had been unconscious for nearly an hour before Officer Gonzalez had found her, just in time. He said that she may have never recovered if he hadn't seen her. But Officer Gonzalez has to give credit where it's due. "I gotta believe that at this point," Officer Gonzalez said, "he pointed me in the right direction. The mysterious black lab's name is John Boy, and without his help, Crystal might not have made it. He clearly loves his owner very much, and somehow knew he had to go and fetch help, from a police officer no less. But John Boy didn't always have Crystal in his life. John Boy had been adopted by Crystal after his 3 previous homes had fallen through. He had been adopted and returned to the shelter 3 times before the pair found each other. "He's very protective of my mom," said Tian Wen. She believed beyond a doubt that John Boy was meant to be with her mother for a reason, and now he had proven it. When the incredible story aired on national television, Crystal was in stable condition while she remained in the hospital, recovering and undergoing more tests. But Tian had a message from her mother for Officer Gonzalez. She met him and immediately hugged the officer with tears in her eyes. She knew that if it weren't for the officer's actions that day, her mother may not have been around to tell the tale. And if it weren't for the loyal canine John Boy, Gonzalez may have never found her.